Hey, this is Dr. C. I hope you've had a good Christmas, and I wish you well for 2023. Hopefully, we'll still be all around in 2023. I hate signing long-term contracts now at my age, so I don't. I usually don't. But at any rate, let's talk about an interesting subject today, body fluids. But specifically, it's the body fluids that we either secrete or excrete. Now, what do I mean by that? Obviously, we got to start with some definitions, right? So, let's talk about, first of all, the CRIN system, C-R-I-N-E. Now, that, believe it or not, is a good suffix, and we use it a lot. There is an endocrine system in our body, and the hormones that are secreted in this endocrine system go directly into the bloodstream. Then there's an exocrine. The stuff that's secreted there goes onto a surface, like the skin, for example. And so you've got these two systems, the endocrine and exocrine. Now, there are several types of exocrine systems that we have. One is called an eccrine, E-C-C-R-I-N-E, eccrine. Those are the little sweat glands that are all over the body, especially marked on the hands, on the palms, and on the soles of your feet. So that's where they're concentrated, but the eccrine glands are all over the body, and they excrete directly onto the skin. Then there's the apocrine, A-P-O-C-R-I-N-E. Those apocrine glands are discharging into the hair follicle canal. So where do you have hair follicles? You have them in the armpits, you have them in the groin. So that's where the most of the apocrine glands are. But still sweat. It's still sweat, but that's where they are. Then there's a thing called a holocrine, H-O-L-O, gland. Those glands secrete something out onto the skin, and they die after they secrete it. So they're not constantly doing this all the time. They die as soon as they secrete it. So those are the types of crins that we have. So let's talk a little bit, knowing that now. We know now that there are roughly estimated about 2.6 million glands in a human body, of all these different types of glands. Let's talk first about sweat glands, perspiration, sweat glands. That's the natural cooling system in our body. Why? Because as water evaporates, it cools. So that if the temperature, core temperature now, internal temperature of our body goes too high, we would have a little sweat. The sweat evaporates, helps to cool the body. So that helps with our temperature regulation in the body. Natural cooling system. So what else is the purpose of sweat besides being a natural cooling system in there? Well, it also helps to maintain our hemostasis. It also, besides that, has something to do with the maintenance of our sodium and potassium chloride in our body. So it has something to do with those elements as well. And there's some things that people have looked into as far as the sweat glands go. And this has led to all sorts of different theories, of course. There's a theory now about cold sweat. What the heck is a cold sweat? That's sweat that comes out when there's fear involved. Fear. Or grief. That's not a good sweat to have, cold sweat. What's the composition of the cold sweat? Same type of composition as regular sweat. Now we sweat quite a bit, depending on what the temperature, the ambient temperature is, how much exercising that you're doing. So there's a lot of variation in the amount of fluid that comes out of you in the form of sweat. Anywhere from 1 to 3 quarts of sweat a day. Now, you may not even feel it. Like now, it's a cold day. You don't feel the sweat, but it's absorbed into your clothing. Now, I guess you could weigh your clothing before you put it on, weigh it after you finish your exercise. You could determine roughly how much fluid you've sweat. We don't normally do that, of course. But a couple of points now about sweat. When you're out on, say you're out on a football field and you're sweating like crazy. So you're probably in the range of maybe up to 3 quarts of sweat for that workout that you're doing. Back in the old days, what we used to do is not only give them some water, but we also gave them salt tablets to try to replenish some of the electrolytes that are in the sweat. So, because sweat does have roughly about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per quart. 1,000 milligrams per quart. Now remember, how much sodium should you take in a day? A teaspoon. How much is in a teaspoon? 1,500 milligrams. That's 1,500. That's the minimum, or I should say, the basic amount we should take in. But you shouldn't take in too much. The maximum is 2,300 milligrams. So 1.5 teaspoons is your max for the day of salt, basically. But what I was getting at now, back with people who are exercising a lot, they now at Florida, in Florida, came up with this concoction now with water, and they put electrolytes and sugar in it. It's called Gatorade. You can buy Gatorade over the counter now all the time. And that made a big difference. No more salt tablets. Now they just drink their Gatorade. Of course, once that came out and once it became very successful with their football team, the Florida Gators, the Pedialyte is now the highest selling one of all of those. The difference between Pedialyte and Gatorade is really in the amount of salt that's in it and the amount of sugar in it. The Pedialyte, especially the Pedialyte, they call it Pedialyte Sport. It has very little sugar. It does have some sugar, but very little. The sugar that's in it is for energy, basically. It gets converted right away to glucose, and so you do need some. And the electrolytes. There's a lot more electrolyte, sodium in other words, in the Pedialyte than there is in Gatorade. Do you need it? Well, that's controversial. So, other things about, the other thing I wanted to talk about with the sweat. Sweat is colorless and it starts out odorless. But, there's always a but, isn't there? When that sweat, especially the ones in the armpits, the apocrine glands in the armpits and the groin, that combines with the bacteria on your skin, diphtheroids. And those diphtheroids then result in odor. Now, some people have a lot more odor from their sweat than others. And it's probably because of the type of bacteria they have on their skin. So that's an interesting topic anyway. We could talk about hyperhidrosis, excessive sweating, and there are a few people, I've known a number who have had hyperhidrosis as well. But that's beyond the talk. So that is number one, sweat. Let's talk about tears. That's the liquid that's secreted by lacrimal glands, which are inside the orbit above the eye, on the sides, and meibomian glands as well, and little goblet cells. There's all three of them can make tears. They make the tears. Now you can make a lot of tears. It's estimated that you can have up to 30 gallons a year of tears. 30 gallons, for God's sake. A year, though, a year. It's not daily, not daily. But it's a fair amount of tear. What's the purpose of tears? Well, the content of tears, once you know the content, then you can decide what the purpose is. Content is mostly, again, water. 97% water. There's also electrolytes in there, sodium, potassium, chloride, a little bicarb. There's also some proteins in that fluid. Now, what's the purpose of the proteins? The proteins are antibacterial. Yes, there's immunoglobulins, immunoglobulin A in there. There's lysozymes. That's an enzyme that helps to kill the bacteria. There's another protein called lactoferrin. That is also antibacterial. So that is one of the purposes then of tears, clear the eye. So not only is there water to hydrate the eye, keep it moist, kill the bacteria, there's also mucin. There's a number of mucins. That's also a protein, and that's secreted by these glands as well. The mucins in there help, it's sticky. The mucins are sticky. That helps to keep the tears on the eyes. So you've got all those things in, and there's also a few lipids in there as well, fats, and oil, in other words. And that keeps everything together, keeps it from evaporating, basically. So all of these things are included in the tears. So there is basically a basal amount of tears that we all secrete, except if you have Sjogren's or one of the dry eye syndromes. Then you have what's called reflex tears. These are the tears that you secrete as a result of something that comes into contact with the eye. Like say you're cutting up some onions, for example. You would have reflex tears. Now that's due to a chemical that's in the onions, synpropanethiol oxide. That is the thing that stimulates the tears in the eyes as well. Chlorine will stimulate them as well. So that's basal, reflex, and then there's also emotional tears. You've heard all sorts of different things about the emotions and their ability to cause tears. There's tears of joy. There's tears of relief. There's tears of grief. All sorts of things. There's uncontrollable tears, sleep tears, age tears. There's tears of all kinds. And so the composition of these all vary just a little, but they all contain about the same thing. Now, if you go out, if you have relatively dry eyes, and as we get older, we all do, they all dry, especially in the winter when everything is closed, the windows are closed, and you got the heat coming up, dries it right out. There are artificial tears, and those artificial tears contain all of the ingredients that you need to form a tear. So in other words, they have a lipid layer, the lipids, that's usually mineral oil. They also have a stabilizing polymer with a little mucus that would stimulate or would be equal to the mucinous things in your tears. They also use the buffers, usually citrate or buffers like that, and preservatives. Unfortunately, the preservatives that are in eye drops do deteriorate fast, and so you have to be aware of the expiration dates on any drops that you put in your eye. It's not the medication that's in the drops. It's the preservative. And so there are some preservative-free drops, and they're much better. They last a lot longer. But that's basically what it is. Okay, that's tears. That's tears. Now let's go down a little further. Nasal mucus, boogers, snot, whatever you want to call it. But it's a very common thing. And let's talk a little bit about it. We produce at least a quart a day of nasal mucus. Now, that varies. It varies from person to person, varies with the temperature, varies with if you're sick or not, varies with many different things. But what is the purpose of this mucus, this nasal mucus? Well, number one, it keeps the lining of the nose moist. Okay, I can understand that because most of the mucus is still water. It's 95% water. And what else? It traps the dust particles and any foreign material that you happen to breathe in if you breathe through your nose. That's good because a lot of that's the purpose of the mucus now. The mucus is sticky and it traps all of these things. And then a lot of the little cells that are in between those mucus cells, in between them they have the little hair shaft coming out. Those are called cilia. And the movement of the cilia is moving everything out. So that's a natural way to clear a lot of the debris that you may breathe in. So those are the purposes of nasal mucus. Now what about we have nerve endings, the sense of smell. Now these sense of smell cells are up higher in the nasal mucus, the lining. And all of the other respiratory cells are further down. These are the ones secreting the mucus and all. So that separates the two functions, basically, of the nose. So there's different colors to the mucus. Normally, mucus is clear, or it may be a little on the whiter side, depending on how hydrated or dehydrated you are. The less hydrated you are, the cloudier the mucus gets. Now, you can also get a lot of infections that come in, viruses, things like that. And what does that do? That irritates and stimulates more mucus. Now, that mucus that stimulates, that can turn yellow at first with a mild infection. Then it turns green. And then if you really get irritated or you start blowing a lot, breaking any little capillaries in the nose, you may get a little blood. Or it may even be brownish, which is older blood that comes out of that nasal mucus. So all these things you have to be aware of. All of those things. So let's go on. Let's talk now about saliva, spit. What do we know about spit? Well, we know that it's colorless, and usually it gets secreted by the cells in the mouth that are in the parotid glands. Those are the big ones. The only time you see those glands on the side is if you had the mumps, where you get a parotitis. Or it's also coming from submaxillary glands. Those are the little round balls you can feel under your chin. Or they can come from sublingual glands under your tongue. Lingua is tongue. Sublingual glands secrete this saliva as well. We secrete a fair amount of saliva during the course of the day, usually a half to a full quart a day. You don't realize it, and you're swallowing it all the time. You're swallowing that saliva all the time. And so, even though the saliva itself is mostly water, you still produce a fair amount. and it does change. Now, what stimulates that saliva? Well, first of all, any acid. Like, for example, if you sucked on a lemon or did something like that, the parotid glands would squeeze out a lot of saliva into that. So that, in fact, they use that sometimes as a stimulatory test to see if you have inflammation in the parotid glands. The other way that will stimulate it will be food. Various foods would stimulate it. Just the thought of food will give somebody a little saliva as well. It may stimulate it excessively and actually cause a little drool as well. So all these things you have to think about with saliva. Now, saliva also has a component to kill bacteria as well. And you can use it also as prognostic. Remember now with the COVID tests and all, some of them just use saliva. You can do the HIV test with saliva. In other words, that saliva will harbor some of the antigen that would react with an antibody. So you need to remember that. Now, if you have a dry mouth, there's preparations you can use. Medications can cause dry mouth as well, besides Sjogren's, besides getting older and not having a lot of the glands that are secreting it. And you can buy some of the stuff that will stimulate or will be similar to the saliva itself. And depending on the type that you buy, you can buy it with all sorts of stuff in it. Most of them are no different than the others. So, okay, that's enough on saliva. Let's go on. Let's talk about earwax. Earwax, cerumen. Well, that's that waxy substance that's secreted in the ear canal. So, where does it come from? Well, there's little sebaceous glands, and there's a little less. The sebaceous glands bring out a lot of the waxy stuff. Now, the apocrine glands that are in there will mix a little of the liquid fluid with it. There's two types of earwax, believe it or not. There's wet and there's dry earwax, believe it or not. Wet and dry earwax. The wet earwax, that's the dominant one in European and African cultures. That usually is a brownish, orangish to brown, light brown color. Has more lipids, more fats in it. And so it's associated with a certain odor as well. People who are from either the United States or Asians usually will have a grayish, the dry type of wax. Grayish and flaky. You're familiar with the flakiness. I'm sure you've seen it. The only time it's a problem, because we have naturally in our body, there's those little cilia again that push a lot of that wax out. And by opening your mouth, opening and closing, you're stimulating those glands and all to push that wax out naturally. Now, if you have a problem with wax, there are a bunch of what they call cerumenolytics, things that will soften up the wax that are on the market, like Debrox, for example. But you don't have to necessarily use Debrox. You can use hydrogen peroxide. In fact, some of these things come, hydrogen peroxide and glycerin, all mixed together. And so they come in little kits, and you can buy them as well. A lot of people, especially ear, nose, and throat people, earn a little living cleaning out earwax out of some of the elderly people. Okay, let's talk about the next one down. Next one down, semen. Yes, semen. That grayish white fluid that comes out of the male urethra, that is semen. Usually, with each ejaculation, you get 2 to 5 ml of semen with about 40 to 60 or 600 million sperm. What produces this semen? Well, it's usually produced in the seminal vesicles. At least 70% of it is in that seminal vesicle, which is right up against the prostate gland. The prostate does produce a little bit of the volume, not the sperm itself, but the volume. That produces about a third of the volume that comes out. The testicles themselves don't produce very much because they just produce the sperm. And that is only 2 to 5% of the volume that's in there. So these are all the things that are producing the semen and all. Okay, let's talk for a moment then about urine. Okay, that's in there to get rid of the excess fluid and to get rid of toxins in your body. Now, the toxins may be the medication that you're taking. That's a toxin for the body too. And so it goes to the liver processes it and goes into the bloodstream and gets peed out, goes out in the pee. So that is one of the purposes then of urine. It eliminates a lot of the water-soluble chemicals that are in your body. It also eliminates the byproducts, some of the byproducts of metabolism in your body, and that goes on all the time. What are the byproducts? They're nitrogen-rich. And so things like urea, creatinine, uric acid, all these things get excreted in the urine. Generally, the urine is a very pale yellow color. The brighter the color, the more dehydrated you may be. So you can get a very intense yellow color if you're very dehydrated. The really bright yellow color comes from either the B vitamins that you're taking, or it may come from medications and all, like pyridium, which we give sometimes to people for their urinary infection. Now, we can also have a bright green. Now, that's usually because of either food dyes or phenol. Or it could be a Pseudomonas bacterial infection. Now, what happens if you get a brownish color to your urine? That's usually old blood, brownish color. Or it may again be medications, nitrofurantoin, metronidazole, dilantin can all cause a brownish color to the urine. Obviously, if you get a red color, that is usually due to either food coloring or natural coloring, like if you have a meal with beets, or it could be blood. God forbid if it's blood. Now, what about the odor? You can tell sometimes just from the odor of the urine what the problem is. If you get a strong ammonia smell, it's urinary infection usually, but it could be an infection from the prostate. It could be menopausal. It could be severe dehydration. If you get a sweet smell, it could be diabetes because you're spilling over sugar. If you get a really foul smell to the urine, or like a fishy odor and all, the fish odor comes from triethylamine. And the foul smell comes from sulfur-containing compounds. It could even be from asparagus, for example, which is usually has a compound with sulfur in it. Or it could be from excessive amounts of garlic as well. And so all these things are all part of the body getting rid of a lot of the waste in your system. I don't have time today to talk about poop. That was my final one. So I'm going to spare you that problem of poop, and maybe we'll spend a whole day on poop sometimes. This is Dr. C. Have a nice day.